Looking for local? Even more local? CCX Media gives you the option to connect with your community on multiple levels. CCX Create welcomes you, community residents, to connect and experience television in an exciting way. The free TV classes we offer will have you on your way to creating TV, and our wide variety of content can be watched at home or on the go. Connect to what's happening in your community. Visit ccxmedia.org.
Welcome to a special program on community media. My name is Bill Weir, the host and producer, and I'm delighted to have with me in Iowa City, Iowa, at the studios of Public Access Iowa City, my friend, former commissioner on the FCC, Nicholas Johnson. Welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's great to be here, or be there, as the case may be.
Well, we're proving, I think, that that public access need not be all in one studio. We're making great connection here, and I'd like to ask you about the early days leading up to public access. You were on the Federal Communications Commission part of that time, and how do you see public access fitting into sustaining democracy and the First Amendment?
Well, it's very prescient of you to start there, because I think that's one of the most important things to know about public access. So if you'll excuse a little pedantry here, I'll give a little short lesson. The elements of a democracy known to Jefferson, you got to expand the vote. We started with white males over 21 who owned land. And so we gradually expanded that to include African Americans, people who didn't own land, women, folks over 18. You need to make sure you've got an educated voting populace. So we had free public education, and we're talking now about expanding that from K-12 to K-14 or K-16. You need to have easily accessible information for the people, and to do that we created public libraries all across the country. You need to be able to reduce the cost of getting books and magazines and newspapers to people, and we did that with special postal rates. And when broadcasting came along, it wasn't, you didn't have to pay to get it like you do now. It was over the air, paid more for the products, but you didn't have to pay for the programming, and the FCC designed the allocation of stations to include as many people as possible. Then we had, in addition to that, universal access to the postal system and to the telephone system. Everybody could get a phone. And now we're trying to expand that with broadband all across the country. So those are all elements of democracy that Jefferson identified. But the one we think of as most important is the First Amendment, which is central to all of this. Now, the law of the First Amendment is pretty straightforward. The relevant language for you and me for this purpose is Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And the courts have expanded the word Congress, which seems to be rather specific, to include all forms of government. So it includes the city government of Minneapolis and St. Paul and of Iowa City. It includes the University of Iowa. and so forth. So the First Amendment applies to them. But in addition to the law of the First Amendment, there are the values of the First Amendment. Why do we have it? Why would we want it? What is the consequence of having it? Well, one is that it contributes to the informed electorate that I was describing earlier. Another is that we believe that truth will more likely emerge from vigorous exchange of views than from some ideological constraint on what people can say. There's the value of being able to check abuses by governments and corporations, other large institutions. By journalists, yes, but also by individual citizens. Then there's the contribution of the First Amendment to what might be called self-actualization, becoming a person, self-esteem, the process of becoming informed and formulating opinions and then expressing them is central to what it means to be human. And finally, the First Amendment is an alternative to violence. When you try to silence people, they're going to express themselves anyway, and it may likely take the form of violence. If you permit people to speak and express their grievances and become involved in national dialogue, violence is less likely. But there are, of course, some limitations on this personal right. Maybe we'll get to those at some point.
Well, that's a good overview of how we came to need I guess we've always needed public access, but could you describe what access the public had before the FCC action? Was there anything?
Well, depends on what you talk about. The state could not prevent you from standing on a soapbox in the city park and talking to whoever might gather. You had that protection, but that is as nothing compared with the multi-hundred-billion-dollar mass media industry in terms of being heard. So that just as in Animal Farm, when it comes to the impact of speech, some are more equal than others. So that's one. Another is that the First Amendment only applies to government. Now, we discussed that, but what are the implications of that? That everybody else is free to censor you. Parents are free to tell their children they can't talk. An employer is free to tell employees what they can say. No reporter has First Amendment rights. The person with the First Amendment rights is the owner. But the owner can fire the editor because of an editorial. They can fire the reporter for the story they chose to write about. So we're not given any kind of legal protection in our day-to-day lives. All this is made worse by the Supreme Court's consistent conclusion that with the owners of the media's First Amendment right to speak goes their right to silence all others. You can have an ad you want in a newspaper. Newspaper will probably take your money and run the ad, but if they decide they don't want to, you don't have any legal right to get that ad in the paper. You don't have any right to put a commercial on radio or television. You certainly don't have a right to have your op-ed column published or to appear as a guest on a commercial radio or television show. And another restriction that came at the end of the 60s, or the early 60s, was the network's insistence that the only programming of sufficient quality to make it onto their stations would have to use what CBS president Fred Friendly once described as a 7,000-pound fountain pen. These enormous and incredibly expensive cameras, far beyond the ability of most any but the most affluent of Americans. The normal American family could not buy one of these. So these were all limitations that were in the way, and most specifically that the public had no legal right to be included in mass media distribution. You might appear as a matter of grace if the newspaper would ask you to write an op-ed, or if the television station would ask you to appear as a guest. My point is you had no legal right to enforce that if they didn't wish to do that. So that was the situation before public access came along.
Well, thank you for summarizing that. One of the questions from the Alliance for Community Media president and CEO, Mike Wassenaar, he has asked, at my invitation, he wrote a number of questions. One of the benefits of public access seems to be a sense of the communities and localities people live in. And why do you think that's important now?
Well, I think that's essential, but you might want me to address first what brought about the changes that led to the effort to create public access, and what were the impediments along the way. At some point, we ought to address all the benefits of public access, and certainly one of them is the fact that it is a community part of the media that involves the community. Community members are coming up with the ideas, they're producing the shows, they're airing the shows, they're learning how to operate cameras and edit, and just sitting here in the PATV studio and offices in Iowa City, one of the first and most nationally outstanding of these public access operations. There have been people walking. We are having a great rain downpour right now, and there are all kinds of people coming in and out of here. I see a car pulling in. There are going to be more people, and they're editing in booths and they're recording stuff and all kinds of things going on here. This is a community center, brings people together. So I didn't want to not talk about Mike's question at all at this point, but let me say what really brought this about was a kind of confluence of events in the mid to late 60s. This was a time of great change in America of all kinds. In politics, in arts, in public demonstrations, advocacy for all kinds of things. So it was an excellent time for public access to come out of that historic period. But the piece of technology that preceded it and played a major role in changing the way people think about television and the rights of the public to communicate was the Portapak. This combination of a recording deck and a camera that now, if not within the budget of the poorest among us, at least could be afforded by institutions and some individuals. It was small enough to carry around. It wasn't light, but it was small enough to carry around. It was no longer a 7,000-pound fountain pen. And what this did was to demonstrate for people that they can also make video, that it is not something that can only be done by 3 networks. Now, there was no way to share it with others unless you invited them to your home or your office or whatever and showed them on a screen the video that you'd made, or you sent them a tape through the mail. But still, the idea was getting around. George Stoney and Red Burns went to a Canadian island and went around town interviewing people, and then brought them together in a movie studio, a movie theater, where they projected this video on a screen. And when they left that town, they left a politically organized community behind them. People saw friends and neighbors expressing themselves about things that they cared about, but they'd never talked to anybody about. And here that all came together. And that gave George and Red, who were really pioneers in this business, an insight to how powerful this television could be. It was kind of like the early days of radio when people didn't understand. They thought there were little people inside that radio box. They couldn't imagine the magic of how voices and music would come out of this little box. Well, it was the same with television. Suddenly people's eyes were open. This is something we can use. We can communicate. We can organize. So these activists began to say, well, we want to use these porta-packs and tell our story and have video we can use at our meetings and to show other people and so forth. So that was really a terrific impact as that changed. But the citizen video was still not on television. It was television, but it wasn't on television in the sense of being on a commercial television station or a cable television system. So what happened then involved a rather convoluted history, which I will try to summarize as best I can, and a large number of characters. And that included the advocates for public access, the cable companies, the FCC, the Congress, and the Supreme Court, and the cities that were franchising cable systems. You couldn't just start, just as you couldn't just start up a television station in a city, you'd have to get an FCC license. You couldn't start a cable system. You had to get a franchise from the city where you wanted to have your cable system. Now we got to take another little detour with some basics about the Constitution and law. No governmental body has any, federal governmental body has any authority, Congress, President, courts, without its being found somewhere in the Constitution. The Constitution grants the Congress power to regulate interstate commerce. Broadcasting and therefore cable we can consider interstate commerce, but it limits the ability of the Congress to delegate its powers to other bodies. So there was a question about how can they just tell this radio commission that became the FCC that they can grant licenses on a standard of what? That they're serving the public interest? What does a public interest mean? So they took this to the Supreme Court, and Frankfurter said, that's specific enough. That's okay. Congress can delegate these powers to the FCC. So that gave the FCC the power to write regulations, unless those regulations otherwise violated the Constitution, which, as we're going to see, became a problem a little later on. So the first thing the FCC did in 1969 was to require cable systems to have local origination of programming. What they were doing prior to that was they would have in a studio like this a camera that would rotate back and forth. and on one end of the rotation would be a clock, and on the other end of the rotation would be a thermometer. And so they were broadcasting time and weather. Well, the FCC didn't think that was quite enough, and they thought it would be better if they actually would originate some programming. Well, cable companies have not always been fond of public access, and they certainly weren't fond of local origination. And so a cable company called Midwest Video ultimately ended up at the Supreme Court saying that, look, this violates our First Amendment rights to tell us that we have to speak. You can't force a person to speak any more, the government can't, any more than the government can silence a person. Well, the court thought that this really was going pretty far for the FCC, but their phrase was, it was still, quote, reasonably ancillary to the regulation of broadcasting. The reason why it was okay for the FCC to regulate broadcasting was because what the cable companies were carrying was broadcast signals. And so it was reasonably ancillary to that connection for the FCC to require local origination. Well, local origination was not the same as public access. So 1972, the FCC came up with a whole bunch of new regulations of cable. I didn't like them. I spent my 7 years on the FCC writing 400 dissenting opinions, all of which are available on that website that you put up there. And at one point I wrote an article in the Yale Law Journal called A Day in the Life, because people thought I was just picking the worst cases. So we picked an entire week's agenda. We went through every single thing the FCC commissioners did and demonstrated why everything they did was wrong. So I was not a kind of to get along, go along guy. I figured we had 7 commissioners at that time because we wanted to have a diversity of views, and boy did I have a diversity of view. This was the one time when I decided maybe I could get something out of this. I was behaving like an Iowa legislator. I said, I wonder what I could get for my vote, because they really wanted their new outrageous policy to be unanimous. And so I said, I'll tell you how you can get my vote. You can get my vote if you require all these cable companies to have 3 channels for the public. One for the public, one for educational institutions, and one for the local government. PEG, they came to be called PEG channels. And so they reluctantly put that into the policy, and I reluctantly voted for their darn cable policy. So once again, Midwest Video challenged, and this time the court decided that Midwest Video was right, that for the FCC to require these PEG channels turned cable television into a common carrier. Well, I thought that analysis was wrong then, and I think that analysis is wrong now. There are a lot of things that the FCC and the Congress require, they're not considered common carrier. Once you get 100, 500 channels, what difference does it make if you got 3 channels that are devoted to something else? It's not a common carrier like the phone company is, where everybody gets access to it. But in any event, that's what the Supreme Court decided. And after I later spent a year with Justice Black as his clerk on the Supreme Court, and we used to play the Supreme Court guards up in the basketball court, up over where the oral arguments were heard. And so Chief Justice Warren pulled in the clerks and explained to us what it meant that the Supreme Court was the highest court in the land. And he said, it's not that basketball court that's up above us. He said, it's us down here, and we hear the basketball bouncing, and you can't do that. So I already knew enough as a result of going to law school to know that what the Supreme Court said was the law, even though I disagreed with it. But that left the advocates for public access no option but to go to Congress, which they did. And that was in 1984, Cable Act. And it didn't mandate public access, but it did authorize it. And so it cleared any argument that the FCC wouldn't have this power. But it made it something that a city could ask the cable company to do. If the city did not ask, they didn't get any public access channels. But if they asked, they could negotiate in their negotiations over the franchise. They could say to the cable company, you're not going to get this franchise unless you give us these 3 channels. So that ended up being the authority for the public channels that we ultimately had. That's a long story, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot of detail to it, and I've summarized a lot as it is.
You've addressed some very important issues, but now we see that one of the problems of access channels is that the very variety that we cultivate, it makes it hard to brand and promote. And there are many different things in many different communities. How can we change that in order to build understanding of their potential?
Well, I think there are many different courses taught at the University of Iowa or any higher education university, but that doesn't affect the fact that the Hawkeyes go out on the football field, except for this coming Saturday, which is a bye week. But, you know, we don't have any problem branding. I think and my wife just hates the word branding, by the way, so I hope she doesn't see this. But what the story is, for what this has to contribute to a community, what it has to contribute to our nation, what it has to contribute to democracy and to the values of the First Amendment. That's the story. And I think that's much more persuasive than a brand, but the story does need to be told. Cable has run into a lot of obstacles since that 1984 act. Cable companies have always found it sort of a nuisance at best. It took franchise fee money away from the city's pothole campaign. So cities weren't always enthusiastic about it once they got it. The public complaints about some of I mean, you open the mic to everybody, you're going to have some things said that not everybody agrees with. And the complaints were usually directed at the cable company, which didn't know that the cable company was legally obliged to not have any control of the content. So you had all those problems. Some city officials were just totally ignorant of what public access was about. Some were afraid that public access programming might criticize them and cause them to lose an election. So it could also, programming could offend businesses, and that produced backlash. There could be copyright issues, and that was a problem. Funding was for many of these public access operations a perpetual challenge, and I hope we have time to talk about some ideas I have about taking care of that problem. But underlying all of these obstacles was the continuing public lack of awareness of what public access was, and viewing television by the standards of commercial television, the production qualities, the celebrities on it, the story. What?
I think, yeah, the production qualities are not to be expected to be up to the commercial television standards.
Well, except for us, they are today because we're using this, what is it, Aaron, 2 times DTV or something? 4X? What is it? 4K. Yeah. So we're using 4K cameras, and I assume that you are too. We're right up there with network quality, no question about that. But the public thought of television as something with high production values, and the money put into producing the shows was enormous. They involved celebrities who were then on the late night talk shows and in movies, and people wanted to see, and they told stories, whether it was a soap opera or an evening show or whatever, and they were judged by their ratings. How many people are watching? Well, that has never been, any of those things, what public access is about. But if you don't know that, and you say, well, gee, how many people watch your show? Or, what are your ratings? Or, well, when do you put on the soap operas? I really like soap operas. When are you going to put on the soap operas? Well, they just don't understand. But that's not their fault. That's the culture they grew up in. It's our responsibility to tell this story, and with examples of what public access studios and organizations, community media have done all around the country.
I agree, and I've struggled with how to figure out what is our brand. The best I've been able to come up with is from my programs a focus on free thinking forum has worked pretty well, and interviewing candidates at length. A half hour or so, so that they can really get convey an understanding of who they are and what they stand for to the voters.
Well, you're doing a real community service with that, but there are other things in the early days of public access that were far less dramatic than substantive what you're doing. For example, there was in one community a fire chief who wanted to have an ability to talk to his various fire stations around the community, kind of a morning briefing and staff meeting type thing. And so he was able to do that with the public access channel. Didn't have a lot of viewers, but it served a very real purpose for him. There was another instance where they hooked together, like we are, 2 retirement homes. And people who had known each other growing up but had not seen each other in recent years could communicate back and forth between these 2 retirement homes. And there are a lot of, really practical. Well, there are churches that will videotape their services and then put them on one of the public access channels for the stay-at-homes who weren't able to come to the church. Well, there are not going to be a lot of people watching that, but it's going to be a real service for those who do. Or a student who's sick and has to stay at home may be able to have a video connection to the school that will enable them to at least listen to what's going on in the classroom and possibly contribute to it as well. So there's an enormous array, and I think we really ought to pull together, maybe a composite half-hour collection of clips of these various things that public access has done. In fact, I think something like that exists, but I haven't seen it for a long time.
Let's find that and get it out to me and many others who would want to incorporate it into one of our programs.
Yeah. Now, there's another problem in recent years, and some people think it's a blessing. I think it's a curse. But I think public access can take it over and use it to their advantage. And that is, not only have we had ever cheaper video cameras, so nobody's lugging around a Portapak today. You can have very small handheld cameras. Well, something no bigger than this microphone could be functioning as a video camera too. But that's a whole nother story about surveillance by the government and privacy rights. But there are 2 billion people carrying smartphones around. Or if not smartphones, at least many of them are, that have video making capacity in them. The one I got in my shirt pocket makes video. And not only do you have the capacity to make the video, you can now post it on YouTube, where people are putting up 300 hours every minute. 300 hours of video every minute gets posted up on YouTube. And you've also got social media and elsewhere, Facebook and Twitter, or people's web pages and blogs, emails, texts can include video. And so many people will argue, well, isn't public access obsolete? Because we now have all these other ways that we can communicate with each other and make video and so forth. So that brings us to a discussion of the value of public access and community media, and why these individual uses of the media are actually doing harm to democracy rather than contributing to it. And we can get into all of that, or if you're interested in it.
Well, you were saying something about you wanted to get to, was it the financing, that public access has the amount of money they need to do the job?
There's some, so I'm addressing, so where do we go from here? What's the future? And along in the course of that, describing the virtues and values of public access and why we would want to keep it. Some outfits have already sufficient financial support. They can keep on doing what they're doing. Maybe the cable company agrees to keep funding the studios and equipment and training programs, and where they don't have a problem. So their future is what their past has been, although even they may want to modify their mission and their operations in some ways. You can't dispute that these new technologies and distribution channels exist. They do. But they don't make media, community media and public access obsolete. They make its values and its contributions even more essential than they've been in the past. So what does community media do for us? Well, it makes top quality studios and equipment like we've got right here, and personnel like we've got right there behind the camera and Aaron, available to people who otherwise could not possibly get access to that kind of a facility. It provides newcomers training and experience in camera work and editing and thinking through how to put a program together and so forth, that may be a kind of training not available elsewhere locally, and that sometimes leads to employment opportunities in the commercial media business. Third, it provides people assistance in putting their project together, what might be called staff-assisted programming, that enhances both the learning experience of the person doing it and the quality of the product they come up with. It can encourage a kind of community dialogue because you can have responses and other people can make programs and so forth. because this is, amongst other things, as I've just described, a gathering place. People come here, they share ideas, and they work together, they talk, they distribute the programming together, and as an audience, the community watches together. So it is a community phenomenon in a way that no YouTube video ever was. In the way that Walter Cronkite was, but it is no longer. I mean, not only, bless him, he's not with us any longer, but because no one like that is today ranked as the most trustworthy person in the country. So those are just a few of what I see as the contributions of community media and public access that this new technology and distribution system simply don't do. Those values of the First Amendment that I described at the top of the show, they're just as valid today as they were in 1791. And community media helps to serve them, whereas this individual media does not. We've got terrible, well, we know about the income inequality, the top 20% and the other 80% that includes all of us. That's a problem, but we also have divisiveness that we've recently received more and more evidence of what the Russians did during the campaign to promote racism, Islamophobia, and to play to emotions and prejudices, showing people who didn't support, well, I won't go through all the, you know what, we're talking about what the Russians were doing, but we're also talking about what the Trump campaign did. And pretty overtly and obviously, and some would try to deny it, but I think it's very hard to listen to his campaign speeches and deny it. And I think these new technologies continue to focus on the individual, the ideological orientation, and so forth, and simply makes divisiveness in our country, which Putin is trying to promote and is doing a pretty darn good job of it, along with Trump's help. So that's why I think it's never been more important for community media to continue. Now, we've got a number of questions, and they would include, what form should community media take in the future? How can these functions be performed if they're no longer a part of a city franchise and cable funded operation? If that's not where public access is going to be, where can community media be based institutionally? And if financial support is no longer coming from franchise fees, what other sources are potentially available? Under Iowa law, the cable companies are not required to continue to pay franchise fees for public access. They are required to continue to provide the channels. So we've got that. Maybe some cable companies can be made to see the value of keeping these. That's going to be a tough sell, but possible. Their incremental cost is going to be virtually zero for doing so. Some places there may be a low power TV station that could broadcast public access material. Maybe it has to be carried by the cable company. If not, at least people with rooftop antennas could get it. There's streaming, which you all do here in Iowa City, don't you, Aaron? You stream programming from your website. It's not the same as having it on the cable, but it is a distribution method. Now, where do you put it? When public access began in Iowa City, it was in the Iowa City Public Library. That's where the studio was, the equipment, the training. You went through a training program, you got a little card that authorized you to walk out of the library with $5,000 worth of equipment. And it could go back to the library. A county government could take this on and see the value of it in bringing the people throughout the county, urban and rural, together. Major universities with journalism schools, communication arts programs, or even progressive high schools could embed this kind of operation within their institution. There are federal arts and humanities grants that could be used for funding. And national and local foundations. We have Johnson County Foundation here. Wealthy donors are always possibilities. And though it might not be ideal because it's nice having everything free, the community media could consider some reasonable charges for services, like productions for hire. They could go out and do productions for other people. They could have per hour charges for editing. Membership fees may be scaled for the ability to pay. And this could be augmented by making more efforts with branding and marketing and whatever to reach out to local institutions, churches, unions, other organizations, schools, nonprofits, and build relationship with them that brings them in, begins to build a political base of support for public access, which I believe public access has not done as much of as might have been to its advantage. It could build membership, have membership first of all, but then build membership beyond the geographical confines of the city. We could reach out throughout Johnson County and some into Iowa and Lynn counties for members for our public and provide services to them. Rather than fighting the new technology and distribution channels, we could offer training to these people to help them do a better job and bring them into the fold in that way and show them the value of the high quality production that you and I are now contributing to rather than using their little smartphones. So I would summarize by saying, prior to your last minute questions, that although the future is unknowable, one can certainly hope that there will be a future for public access in community media because of the contribution that it has made and can continue to make to the creation and sustaining of American democracy. And as you used to say as our minister down here, and thus endeth the reading.
What do you say to the statement, if we lose public access, we're on our way to autocracy?
I think we're going to get to autocracy faster than we realize with or without public access, but I think public access would help to slow it up a little bit. I think one of the worst things that the new administration has done in terms of democracy is this overt, constant drumbeat of ridicule and diminishing the reputation of the media. Fake news, dishonest media, awful people, they don't really like America. Democracy can't withstand that. Jefferson said if I had to choose between a government with no newspapers and newspapers with no government, I would not hesitate to choose the latter. The media is essential to maintaining a democracy. Respect for the media, recognition of the contribution they're making. The number of journalists who are killed in foreign countries and here, trying to cover stories and bring us information. The quality of many of these people. I'm not saying they don't ever make a mistake, but they certainly are not fake news. And reporting that somebody in government is engaged in fake news, over 1,000 fake statements coming out of the White House so far. Reporting on the existence of fake news is not fake news. That's reporting about fake news. Well, I'll get off of that podium. You give me another question.
Okay. There are some communities that choose to have government access and educational access channels, but they don't allow for publicly produced content on public access channels.
Well, shame on them.
What?
I said shame on them, Bill.
Well, yes, but how do we better convince the community that the public access channel is essential?
Well, I think by doing the very things I just finished talking about. I mean, the things you do to provide political support for public access, to provide financial support, to expand the base, to bring more people in, to reach out to institutions. I tell you, you in a community like that, you do outreach to the local churches and labor unions and nonprofits and other organizations in town and explain to them how much this could do for them. Build a wonderful story about Franklin Roosevelt. A fella came in and made a proposal to him, and the president said, I agree with you absolutely. We simply must get that done. Now you go out there and make me do it. What did he mean by that? He mean you build up the support. When the people will lead, their leaders will follow. When I was a lot of people trying to get me to run for the United States Senate. And last conversation I ever had with President Johnson, I called him up. He was in Acapulco, and I said I was thinking about this, and what advice did he have? And he said, well, my advice is you're going to need an awful lot of really good friends all across the state of Iowa. Well, that's what public access needs. That's what he would advise public access channels. You're going to need a lot of friends throughout your relevant area.
Yep. Now, you may not be aware of this, Nick, but here in Minnesota, when the legislature was considering the cable communications bill, we were able to get successfully into that bill a provision for a metro-wide channel that functions in some ways like a public access channel.
And it covers both the Twin Cities, I gather.
Yes, the 7-county area.
Yeah, great.
My opinion is that more metro areas need this kind of channel to supplement the broadcast channels that are focused increasingly on reaching out to a much wider area.
Now, on this metro-wide channel, can you put public access material on that?
Yes, all the time.
And what is it? Kind of a all-in-one PEG channel? Educational institutions can use it, and government can use it, and public access?
Generally requires membership, which provides for a half-hour, a specific half-hour or hour program each week or each month.
See, I would think that, again, like Lyndon Johnson said, I mean, everything requires organization. Everything requires getting out there and door knocking and calling and doing what, it's a political campaign. But I think doing that in large cities ought to be something that could be sold. I think it's a great idea. You know, in Iowa, I tell everybody to look north. That's where our ideas can come from. We don't have to go all the way out to California. You just find out, you know, my mother used to say when I was a little boy, go find Nicky, find out what he's doing and tell him to stop it. Well, I tell people, go to Minnesota, find out what they're doing and let's start it.
Well, in our studios here in Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, I mean, northwest suburbs, yes, we reach out to the people of these municipalities very intensively, but we also reach beyond, as we are right now, to the nation as a whole. So, Nick, this has been a wonderful conversation. I thank you for taking the time. I know you're preparing a talk to the Library of Congress.
Yeah, that's on what's called public broadcasting, Corporation for Public Broadcasting's 50th anniversary, and they're bringing Dean Acheson once wrote a book, Present at the Creation. Well, they're bringing together the people who were present at the creation of the public broadcasting system, which is far from the values of public access, but also performs a function that was, at least by original design, to be something other than commercial television.
Yes. Well, we've covered a lot of ground, and I look forward to talking with you again when there may be further developments in public access, community media. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bill.